Chapter 5. So today I want to focus on Chapter 5 and part of Chapter 6, and we'll look at bone tissue. We won't finish again through all of that today, but on Thursday, tomorrow, we'll get to the rest of Chapter 6. Okay. But Chapter 5 is the integumentary system, and now we're in our first organ system, right? This is our number one organ system, very first one. And so we're past the basis of anatomy, physiology in the human body, and now we're building ourselves up to organ systems. At this point forward, all the organ systems will be covered in A&P 1 into A&P 2, and that's really what that's all about, right? Okay. So let's start here, right? The integumentary system and what it's composed of. And many people think of this system as the quote-unquote skin system, but that is a misnomer. It's incorrect, right? Because not only is it just skin, but we also put hair, nails, and then these two glands, among others, in the integumentary system, but these two main glands, and they all encompass the integumentary system. So it's not just skin, it's the other. Because those are so important, because those kind of relate to a lot of everything that we're talking about. That one is a wherever that one is, yeah. But the other ones that we don't spend a lot of time with, like the hair stuff, don't worry about that, at least in lecture. Don't worry. Let me talk about these two before we move on to hair, to past hair, right? The hair matrix is the portion of the hair where you're going to see active mitosis. Okay? Here's where the cells reproduce or undergo mitosis and produce more cells and then add to the hair, and this is how the hair will continue to grow. Does that make sense? And it pushes itself back up, and then that strand continues to grow and grow and grow, basically. But it comes from the matrix, hair matrix, okay? The rector pili, and it's actually a muscle. It's a smooth muscle attached to the follicle. And the reason I mention that, because it's also in the skin model. You see that little band of muscle there. When that muscle contracts, it actually will push or pull, if you will, the hair straight up, and then pucker the skin around the scalp, and this is where we see goosebumps forming. All right, and that muscle will be pulled in response to then touch sometimes, or emotional responses. Fear sometimes does that, things like that, right? I just want to show you where the actual hair matrix is. And it's this little band of, or this little row of cells here. That row of cells there produce all the cells that become all of this other stuff here. Okay, that's the matrix. Now, if you're going to pluck a hair, if you're going to pull it out of your scalp, you would pull the whole thing out except for, and I'll use this other area here, except for that right there. Everything else comes off when you pluck a hair, when you pull a hair. The whole other, everything beside what's inside the red line will be pulled away, right?
So is that kind of what they kill off when they do laser hair removal?
Yeah, good. So when a laser is applied to this area and shot here, shot there, what they're doing is trying to kill the cells that are the hair matrix, right? You got to kill them all, because if you kill them all, then the hair won't grow. But if you leave one or two behind, eventually the hair will become the hair. It'll grow and make more hair matrix and then make more hair. Or if you kill enough of them, it'll take a really long time before the hair comes out. That's why it takes sometimes weeks or months before you see a hair again. But if you can successfully kill all of these cells, then the hair won't grow back. Yeah, sure. types of hair that you see in the body, thin versus thick or vellus versus terminal, where you see that, and in what life stage and what gender you see that in. We talked a little bit about how nutrition and hormones affect growth, but I just mentioned that. I didn't really go into that. And then talked about how much hair grows, and then we go through these cycles between what we call active and regressive phases. And so now we're on a little bit of clinicals. Talk about some of those, and especially alopecia, and then we'll move on to nails, okay? So this can happen. We can have an issue where women express or secrete too much androgen or male sex hormone, testosterone in specifically. So this can actually happen. There's a great example of this. We call this polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? PCOS. And in PCOS, because there is a lot of impacted oocytes or mature eggs, and they don't get secreted regularly on a monthly cycle, 28-day cycle. When they actually stay in the ovaries as a mature egg, they actually produce and secrete androgens, male sex hormones, and females also produce male sex hormones. And because of this, we can see this, right? Excessive hairiness or overgrowth of hair in females. Signs of masculization because there is an expression of the testosterone. And this is just to show you that hormones are, one of the crucial components in hair growth. Also in what we call secondary sex characteristics. And so this is what can occur there, right? So this is something we also see as well, what we call alopecia. Alopecia is a hair thinning. Happens in both sexes after 40, okay? And so this can occur because the 40 threshold is usually a place where both male and female sex hormones start to decline greatly. And we know that the hormones we just talked about that they influence hair growth and thickness. This is what we see there, right? We call this alopecia. And again, this term is for both male and female. What we call true or frank baldness, okay? There is a genetic component, and it can be dictated on one sex more than the other, like male pattern baldness. And again, this is immature response to a hormone. This is a subclass of testosterone. Because it doesn't respond to that, we start to see the hair die, and this is what you see in male pattern baldness, okay? All right, so let's move on to nails, talk about the three main parts of nails, and then we'll move on from there, okay? So nails, I think I mentioned this, but it's actually just almost skin with hard keratin. Instead of soft keratin, we call this hard keratin. And again, it's a protein. It's just that it's the same thing as keratin, except it's a little bit different, chemically different. And so when we add keratin to this skin, if you will, then that skin hardens greatly, and this is where nails really come from. What are the functions of nails? A protective cover of basically the ends of the fingers and toes, because we know that there is a rounded end of the bone there, can be susceptible to damage. Bone would actually sometimes be torn out if you didn't have the nail, but since the nail is there, it protects the actual finger there, if you will. So it's composed of these three main areas: the free edge, the nail plate, and what we call the root. And we'll look at the figure here to kind of orient ourselves of what that is. Another underlining structure we call the nail bed is a layer of epidermis underneath the nail plate, which is actually the pinkish portion of the nail underneath the. Okay, so there's a long band of epithelial tissue there. Just like we have a hair matrix, we also have a nail matrix, and the matrix is where we have nail growth. So this is where mitosis occurs, and then we keratinize this, and it becomes then the nail. Okay. Couple other structures here, but I'm not concerned about you all really knowing these for an exam, at least for the lecture exam. There'll be this figure that you see here in the lab when we get to that part of the lab, and you'll have to know those names and match those up in a lab exam. But just to show you where everything's at, if I draw a little circle, or actually draw in the epidermis right there, wherever you'd see the red area, is where the nail matrix would be. Okay? So that's the epidermis layer where it undergoes cell division and then becomes and pushes and becomes the nail itself. So this skin right here, this layer of epidermis tissue will divide, keratinize, and become hardened nail, and then push its way from back here all the way forward, and continue to do that, right? So that doesn't stop. In fact, it continues to push itself out. That is actually underneath, and this is where we talk about when we talk about the nail root, but it's underneath what we call the epicondrium or the cuticle, right? Everybody knows what the cuticle is. That's that fold of skin right here, fold of tissue right here. Underneath there is the nail matrix with the nail root, and then in back would be the tissue there. Let me just would be the tissue back here, where the nail begins to be hardened, where we consider this hardened nail. This would be the nail root, and then that would be the cuticle right here, and then this would be the continual nail plate, and we call this the free edge, the edge that doesn't have skin underneath, right? This is the area you would cut basically with nail.
So what exactly happens, like, for instance, my daughter smashed her finger in the door and it's like black now, like what exactly happens there scientifically?
Yeah, so you've actually damaged and bruised this tissue and maybe this tissue, right? And she's definitely broken the blood vessels. You can see those little blood vessels. They're actually going this way, right?
Yeah.
But there are blood vessels nonetheless here and then under here. So with the force of whatever it was, smashed your finger this way or whatever, broke those blood vessels and bruised or damaged this tissue here. Now it will grow back, right? So eventually that tissue will die. Some of it is dead, and then your body gets rid of it.
Yeah.
The other stuff will be regenerated. But if you get to the nail matrix and you damage that enough, you've killed enough of those cells, then the nail will be deformed. And that can't happen, right?
Yeah.
Depends on how bad you damaged your finger. But that's what you see there. A lot of it's fat, and the fat is okay. It's the tissue that usually gets damaged, and that's, there's skin all the way around here, but basically. So depends on how she squashed it, or if it was in a door.
But it was like a month ago, and it's completely black, like even past the cuticle, you could tell.
Yeah. It's not, so there's a little bit, I don't want to say necrosis, but there's a little bit of cells that are dead, right? It's not the whole finger's dead, but cells that are dead and the body's trying to get rid of it, right? So those cells turn black, or the blood turns black, and then they're just trying to clear up. So you see the change there. It'll happen. It's going to take a while because this takes a while to kind of get all set up.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah. Sometimes the nail falls off, and I don't know if that's happened yet, but
It hasn't happened yet, but
yeah.
I can tell, like, the cuticle's not touching the nail anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's black.
So, sometimes the body will reject the nail, so it'll, you know, it'll dissolve the nail and let the nail fall off, and then grow everything back because it's not really sure whether it's how bad the damage is. So sometimes the nail will fall off and grow back. Okay, so sometimes you can see this, right? Looking at nails and the color and the shape sometimes can indicate disorders, diseases, issues like that. So sometimes a yellowish color might be an indicator of a respiratory disorder, thyroid gland disorder. Thickened yellow nail, usually a fungal infection. What we call spoon nails, when there's the bowing of the nail, right? Kind of bulging of the nail. Iron deficiency. And these horizontal lines that are usually, you know, white sometimes can be indicative of some of these things here. Okay, something going on with the cardiovascular system. You can see that occurring there. Here's the bowing of the nail. This is what you see. All right, can you see that kind of divot there? I mean, it'll bow out sometimes, but it's a little divot. Okay, let's talk about the two glands here really quick, and then talk about some of the subsets of those, and then try to finish this off. Okay, sweat glands are called pseudoniferous glands. You find those in all skin surfaces, with the exception of the nipples and part of the external genitalia. Everywhere else you would find sweat glands, right? So again, a little factoid, right? 3 million per person of sweat glands, and there's two types. We call an exocrine sweat gland and an apocrine sweat gland. Both secrete sweat, but the composition of that sweat's a little bit different. Okay. Now, these glands, and obviously if it is this would be my little gland. Lining the gland would be all of these epithelial tissue, right? Each of those squares represent a cell, right? And then those cells, their responsibility is to make whatever sweat it's going to be, right? Does that make sense, right? Remember seeing the gland. Again, these squares represent each cell. They secrete their product there, and this is a duct, and then there would be a pore at the edge of the skin surface, right? That's what we're looking at. And so those cells are called myoepithelial cells that line the duct just like this. The nervous system can stimulate these cells and will stimulate those cells to force the sweat into the duct and then eventually out of the pore. That makes sense, right? So it's under a nervous stimulation. Our most numerous one that we have is the exocrine sweat gland. You see that in the palms, the soles, and the forehead. You see the most concentration there in numbers, right? Those ducts connect to pores. Those pores connect to the outside of the surface of the skin. Their main function is for thermal regulation. And what we mean by that is to control body temperature, right? They are regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And will act because of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are part of what we call the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system. And this is part of the nervous system that's under automatic control in the body. Okay? So when our body gets too hot, these places the nerves will stimulate those areas, and then those areas will secrete their sweat to cool down the body. Does that make sense? Right? So that's condition of that, so it's on autopilot, but sometimes it can be overridden by, for example, emotions. So when people get nervous or scared, that can stimulate the autonomic nervous system to stimulate those glands to secrete a lot of sweat. That's why when somebody's really nervous, let's say they get up and they want to speak in front of people, because almost always, somebody's, got that fear, that anxiety, they start sweating. And that's part of that response. So sometimes that can emotions and stuff like that can override these areas. 99% of it is water, but we do have other things like salts, of course. Vitamin C is also found there. Antibodies, which are part of the immune system. Dermacidin, which is a protein that kills microbes, is part of the immune system as well. And metabolic waste. Things from cells, creating energy or building stuff. Side products that we consider waste can also be excreted out through sweat as well. Okay, so this is what we're looking at, and in fact, this part of the skin model, as we revisit it, is an exocrine sweat gland. Kind of looks like a snake, basically, kind of bundled up together. It's kind of how I've always remembered it. And if you cut it in like it's doing in that plane, and look at it under a microscope, this is what we're seeing. So we're taking the tube in many places and cutting it this way, and that's why you see these different kind of hole structures, because we've cut the thing in a frontal plane, and just so you can look at the different cells. And those purple dots represent the nuclei, which is the nucleus of the cell. Those are the ones that secrete the sweat that we're talking about. Okay, so what about the apocrine sweat gland? Okay, this is not exocrine, but this is apocrine, right? Confined basically to the axillary region or area and the anogenital area. The anus and the genital area. Anogenital. The secretion is milky, yellowish, thick type of sweat. It does contain more fats and more proteins, because of which the composition is much thicker. Now, bacteria love to actually consume this fatty substance that gets secreted in the sweat and the proteins that secrete in the sweat, and because of which bacteria will break down or consume those products from sweat. And they also have metabolic waste as well. They also have side products that they can't use. And those side products get secreted or taken out of the bacteria's body, the bacterium's body. And that leads to this, right? Body odor. Okay? That's where body odor, essentially one of the main components, comes from, right? The smell, if you will. It's actually from bacteria on the skin surface, bless you, getting broken down or breaking down the products that are found in sweat and breaking those down, and then their side product causes the body odor smell that we know, right? That's the main source of body odor, but there's other things as well, including the metabolic waste that adds to body odor as well. They're larger than exocrine sweat glands. Their ducts empty into hair follicles. They are inactive before puberty, and at puberty they actually begin functioning. That's why children, for example, don't need deodorant. Does that make sense to you? Bless you. Although they do have a smell, and obviously every human has a little smell, but they wouldn't need deodorant per se, right? Because these are not active. When puberty hits, those hormones dictate that these become active, and this is where you see the production in, again, these two areas. Okay. Now, one of the theories out there, which is there's a lot of research to show this, is that we think it may act as a sexual scent gland. That these areas that secrete the fatty substance and the proteins, which vary from human to human, may act as a scent gland in the sexual capacity. We call this a pheromone with an E, sorry. Pheromone, right? Now we know pheromones exist, but we know they exist primarily in animals, right? We know that animals will secrete secretions from themselves, sometimes urine, but other little glands that are kind of behave like this. And we know that they have hormones that attract the opposite sex, basically, for reproduction. I mean, you can use any animal you want, but white-tailed deer are always, when a doe is hot, basically, which means they're in the reproductive capacity, they're ready to go. They'll secrete products in their urine because there are glands next to the urethra that will secrete as they're urinating, and so will the bucks, basically, male deer. Will do the same thing when they urinate or when they do a rub, because there's actually glands up on the horns and in the genital tract. So we think that this kind of works almost the same way with humans. Does that make sense to everybody? That's what we see here. The cologne business is actually based on this, right? Because there were chemists at one time that kind of saw this kind of thing and said, okay, we can kind of make something almost exactly in that area, and that's kind of where cologne perfume kind of come from. Attractants. So there are two modified apocrine glands here as well. What we call a cerumeous gland. This lines the external ear canal. We're talking about all the way from the outside part of the ear that you can, over by the canal, all the way through the canal or the tube, all the way to the eardrum, right? That's the external ear canal. Lining all of that tissue are these glands that secrete cerumen, which is the textbook name for earwax, right? And that's a modified sweat gland. Now, we've concentrated the amount of lipids in it and proteins and taken away a lot of the water from the substance, and that's really why there's a thick, waxy substance that we call earwax. That's why it's in its composition that way. The mammary glands are also a modified apocrine gland, and what they do is, of course, secrete milk after birth in a female, and that's actually a modified sweat gland, in fact. Looks a lot like the glands that you would see in other places of the body, which we looked at. Remember that figure that had all the, kind of looks like a tree, bunch of and whatever. That's what you see there. Okay, sebaceous gland. It's found in a lot of places, with the exception of the palms and the soles. We don't have oil glands there. Most of them you find attached to hair follicles and secreting products into hair follicles, but not always. Sometimes you'll find them separate by themselves. Now, their secretions will be super low, if not absent in humans, all the way until puberty. And in puberty, this one also kicks up the production, if you will, or the activity. It is stimulated by hormones, and specifically sex hormones. Androgens, even more specific, are the ones that actually will start this process. And we know that in puberty, there's a big uptick in these hormones, sex hormones, which cause these major changes in the body, but this one in particular. Okay? The oil secretion that oil glands secrete is called sebum. Sebum. It's got chemicals that are bactericidals, which means it's chemicals that kill bacteria. That's cidal means death, right? Okay. Which is important because you're going to have a lot of interaction with all kinds of things, including bacteria on your skin. And you want to protect the gland itself from bacterial infection because it's actually an open area to the outside of the body. It's a wonderful place for bacteria to go in. So you would naturally have oil. You know, the gland would have properties that would kill bacteria.
What exactly makes those like more hyperactive in some individuals?
More hyperactive in some. It's
How extremely oily.
it's genetics. And what I mean by genetics, it's genetics as far as how many you have, how many of those are concentrated in one area or several areas, and then genetics and the fact that how much hormones you produce and at what time, or if it's frequent,
Right.
because that's also, all those things are indicative of somebody going to be an oily person or not so oily, and that's what you see in face creams, face washes, because some people are super oily, some people are super dry, because that all depends on that. And it's going to vary depending on the person because the genetics are a little bit different.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was like a dietary thing, since there's something
It's-
like that, or if it was just
no.
a really natural occurrence.
So that's one of the what I like to call old wives' tales, but that's one of the old wives' tales, the fact that if you eat oily things, you're going to be an oily person, you're going to have oil secretion increase. That's not true. The reason why people think that is because when people do eat oily things, they tend to have a lot of oil deposit on their body, like in their face. Like if they're eating, I don't know, fried chicken,
Yeah.
right? It's an oily thing. They're going to have oil on their face, going to seem that they've secreted a lot of oil, and I think that's where that comes from. It's where people think that it is, but that's not necessarily true. It will be indicated on the on conditions too, on your daily life. For example, if you sweat a lot in general, let's say you're in an area and you work out a lot, or your job isn't outside, well, obviously you're going to secrete a lot of sweat, but also oil too. So naturally you're going to have that as well. So it just depends on where the human is and what they are doing
Yeah.
as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so here's a sebaceous gland right there. Okay? It's shown as a little kind of blurb, if you will, next to the hair follicle. This is where that would be found. Sometimes, again, they're found separate. They don't have to be on a hair follicle. Usually they are, but they don't necessarily have to be. They can be separate. But nonetheless, they're depositing their oil. The oil will travel up the hair follicle all the way up to the surface, soften the hair because it will bathe the hair, cover the hair, and then cover the skin. And will soften the skin because oil actually does a good job of softening things, right? So you see that. You see the exocrine one that we just saw here. These right here are apocrine sweat glands. Those are the thicker sweat that we just talked about. Thick sweat, it's kind of oily, or I'm sorry, yellowish. Okay, both of those on the right, sweat, on the left is oil. And you can see, here's the hair follicle right here. Here is that sebaceous gland and all the cells, and they secrete that goes up this way, along with the hair. That's what you're seeing here. By the way, we're cutting it kind of cross section or frontal, whatever, and we're seeing that. Okay, so here's just a breakdown. If you looked at them separate from everything else in a skin model, here's what you see. You see the exocrine kind of separate. You see the apocrine tied to a hair follicle. You see a sebaceous there as well. So, and this table is really good because it kind of puts all three of them together. Okay. Okay, let's talk about acne, right? It's always a common issue for everybody, right? Everybody it's got some sort of acne in some part of their life, right? This is a keyword is infectious, right? It's an inflammation response from our body, but it's an infection is what it is, right? It's an infection of the sebaceous gland, the oil gland, and what we see as a result is a pimple, right? We call this a pustule in medical science, but it's a pimple, right? And usually it's because of one bacteria, and there's the bacteria, but you don't need to know that, but it's Propionibacterium acne or acnes. That's the bacteria that causes the infection. You find that commonly on the skin. It's only when that bacteria infects or goes into the gland and starts to infect the cells there is when you start to see the inflammation response, the pus, if you will, the pimple, right? Now, when the sebaceous gland becomes blocked sometimes, and that oil secretion becomes concentrated, we see a whitehead form. If that makes sense, on the pore, edge of the pore. When it is exposed to air, there's a chemical change. We call this oxidation. And that white portion of the fat becomes black or dark, and we call that a blackhead. That's the difference between a whitehead and a blackhead. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? All right. So we see this occurring, right, in infants, right? Overactive sebaceous glands or oil glands. Seborrhea. We also know that to be cradle cap, right? That's cradle cap in an infant, right? It's not because they have an infection, it's just an overproduction of the oil glands. And why is that the case? Because this young infant hasn't had all of the homeostatic controls matured enough. Does that make sense? In an adult human, oil secretion does get controlled, right? We don't over secrete unless there's, there may be somebody that secretes a lot or a little, but not over secretion. That's a rare instance because we have homeostatic controls. Our body is balancing everything out. But in an infant, since they're brand new, those controls are not there yet. Some of them are kind of still missing. And so sometimes you'll see cradle cap form because that's just an overproduction of the oil. And that oil is secreted out on the top of the head, and then it becomes brown. It kind of goes yellowish brown and it flakes off. That's cradle cap. It's self-limiting, which means it will go away. Okay. All right, so here are the functions of the skin. I know we already kind of talked about this, believe it or not, although we didn't define them this way, but we talked about those, right? We know that it protects the underlining tissue. We know it regulates temperature. Sweat glands do that, right? Just talked about that one. We didn't talk about the sensations, right? The sensory stuff. We did talk a little bit about it, but not a lot. The metabolic functions of it, talked a little bit about that, but not a lot. The blood, where that's found, just a little bit. And then the waste, we just mentioned waste, but we didn't really dive into that. Okay, so I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through each one of them. So as far as protection, there's three ways it protects, right? Chemically, physically, and biologically. Chemically, in the fact that we've got things to protect chemicals from destroying, damaging underlining cells in tissue. Physical, we talk about force, right? Rubbing, scraping, pushing, bumping. And biological, we talk about other living organisms trying to infect us or, disrupt our cells or kill our cells. And that's what we talk about when we talk about bacteria. So skin will secrete many different chemicals, right? So those chemicals act as a barrier to other things, right? We talked about antimicrobial proteins, dermacidin, right, is one of them. So many of these proteins get secreted from the skin, act as a nice little chemical barrier for other things like microbes to try to enter. And you'll notice all three of those has something to do with a microorganism, right? Because again, the skin is a wonderful area for a bacteria or a virus to enter, right? So we got to have a lot of secretions to protect us there. Now, these secretions and the surface of the skin is what we call an acid mantle, like a mantle on a fireplace, right? It's a covering, it's a shelf, if you will. And that has to do with the pH, because the skin has a very low pH. Okay? Okay, so this is a pH scale, right? I didn't draw it all, but we should go from 1 to 14, right? 14 being really basic or alkaline. Number 1 being the highest acid level, or 0 actually, but acid level, right? Really strong acid level. Well, they're talking about low pH, so they're talking about low pH number. So it means it's acidic. The skin is acidic. Does that make sense? Low pH number, more acidic. Okay. And we all know what melanin does already, right? UV ray absorbs that light. That's what that's for, right? Physical barrier, right? So we know that the stratum corneum is keratinized. We know that that is protects us from, for example, an intake of water, water-soluble substances cannot enter that area. But some chemicals do have the capability of entering our skin. If that chemical is lipid soluble, right? So the keratin blocks water, but will allow things that are kind of lipid based to come in. Some of these chemicals called oleoresins, but those poison ivy, we talked about chemicals like that. That's kind of a lipid based chemical. Poison ivy can go through the skin. Solvents like that, acetone paint thinner can actually embed the skin, can go through the skin. Heavy metals can go through there. And some drugs can go through there. Right, so just to kind of just summarize everything, some things can go through there, but most things get blocked out if they're, depending on if they're water soluble or fat soluble. So along with the chemicals that get produced to block other living organisms, other microorganisms, we've got cells in place to actually migrate and destroy any microorganisms that do pass through those barriers to try to enter into deeper tissue. We know what dendritic cells are, right? Dendritic cells are migrators in skin. They're going to engulf or phagocytize, right? Pac-Man. Any foreign invader, this would be vis-a-vis a microorganism. Or even any of those chemicals, they'll start to try to break down those chemicals too. So they're even attacking foreign things like maybe, let's say, acetone, paint thinner or something like that, that we touch with our skin. They'll try to invade that. And that's in the epidermis. You know, the dendritic cells are in the epidermis. And in the dermis, we have macrophages. Those are also phagocytic. So those are in the loose connective tissue. Okay, in the papillary area, that's loose areolar connective tissue that migrate. Those are the macrophages. So even if they go, that bacteria, let's say, passes all the layers and gets into the dermis, we've still got macrophages there patrolling. So this is what can happen with solvents, organic solvents or heavy metals, right? Lead, mercury can be absorbed through the skin. Any of your organophosphates can go through the skin, like the big one right now. Well, the one that we've been looking at for a while in science is Roundup. You know what Roundup is? It's a chemical that you use to kill weeds. Yeah. So it can be absorbed in the skin. That's the issue because Roundup gets used in the household sense. So you can go buy Roundup at Walmart and spray it right down, kill weeds in your yard or whatever. But the big issue is that Roundup gets used in the commercial sense. So in agriculture, they spray Roundup in the big tractors, or sometimes, and I think they're trying to get away from this. Everybody hears the plane, the yellow plane that comes around the Garnerfield Airport. Well, that gentleman is spraying probably insecticide on some of the fields around this area. We would use Roundup there, but the issue is that stuff does hit the plants and kills insects or weeds, let's say. But the issue is that it also goes into the air, and when it goes in the air, you get it on your skin. And then that's where it gets soaked in.
That's where they're trying to link a lot of migrant workers, field workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer, is linked to exposures to this kind of stuff, like some of those chemicals, organic solvents.
So how does that work? Like, 'cause most of those fields are like for produce or whatever. Like, does it absorb into that food and then when you eat it, it's in your body as well?
No, well, the research doesn't show that it does. They've done a lot of research behind that. They show that it doesn't do that. It doesn't absorb through the tissue of the plant or the fruit or whatever. But it doesn't mean that it's not on the surface. That's why they always tell you to wash your fruit, right, or veggies or whatever. Make sure you get it off because that can be still found on there. Yeah, even though they do rinse them, they go through sometimes a triple wash, which we call that triple wash. Can still be found there. Yeah. No, but they don't see that occurring. At least that's what the research said. Yeah. But once it goes through your skin, let's say an organic solvent also, for example, is gasoline or diesel fuel, those type of things, or oil-based stuff. That's an organic solvent, by the way. So we get that a lot too. I mean, that's why touching gasoline can be, you'll try to prevent that as much as possible. But we all fill up our gas, so we all touch the handle, and that all sometimes is filled with gasoline. You can smell it on your hand when you fill gas. Sometimes they have gloves there at the convenience store. Sometimes they don't. But that can go through your skin and then enter your bloodstream. And then when it travels through your bloodstream, depending on how much it is, when it hits your kidneys, it can cause your kidneys to break down. So they can die that way. They can necrose basically through toxicity. So it's a nephrotoxin. It can actually damage the cells of the kidney and cause death. And then if it gets into the brain, because it can do that, because the blood barrier from the blood to the brain, there's a nice little pretty barrier. But if it's in a large amount, it can pass over into brain tissue. Okay. It can also affect blood, so we see that too. Depending on what it is, lead can do that. That's why lead is dangerous and poisonous, because it actually can destroy your red blood cells. You don't get enough oxygen, then you die. Right? So that's why it's really important to be really careful in touching that. It's hard to say that with somebody that's working a manual labor job and doesn't understand that that's gasoline you shouldn't be touching with your hands. Or changing oil and letting the oil just touch you if you're a mechanic. Those are issues. Or if you're working oil and gas and you're using not only pumping oil, but you're using all those chemicals to help frack and pump oil. Those are really bad for the body. Which probably doesn't get covered by the insurance, and you start to get sick. You work in oil and gas. That's another issue too. It's a big issue right now. All those gentlemen doing that. Yeah. Okay. Body temperature regulation, right? So we actually, the sweat glands produce sweat all the time consistently, and then we can increase the amount of sweat we produce. Okay? So even though you don't see sweat, you are still sweating per se, and this is what we call that. Insensible perspiration is the sweat that's always getting secreted per se. So this is the resting body temperature. That's how much you produce that is unnoticeable. You don't even notice that you're sweating, but that's the sweat. Not only, we're not talking about forehead, just forehead or chest or whatever. We're talking about just all over the body. About 500 milliliters, half a liter, which if you measure that out, that looks like a good amount, right? But that's spread out throughout the day, all parts of your body.
So the unnoticeable one is the insensible.
Insensible, right? The other one that you do notice, that you do see, is called sensible, and that's when the body temperature rises. Up to 3 gallons, right? That's a lot of sweat, by the way. 3 gallons of sweat is a lot, but if you picture somebody, let's say, working out or going outside and running during the heat of the day, they're drenched, right? Or somebody working in their job and it's very hot, they're drenched, right? There are 3 gallons, and that's the sensible one. That's designed to cool off the body, and so we get both of these. One is consistently there, one can be kicked up or kicked down, depending on the temperature of the body. In the cold external environment, when the body starts to get cold, okay, the blood vessels in the dermis contract or constrict, and then that blood gets funneled or kind of located into the central part of the body to keep the internal core temperature warm. Does that make sense? So you start to lose heat. And that's why people's hands sometimes get cold, right? Like when it's really cold outside and people's hands feel like cold at the edges, is because your blood is not getting pulled to those areas anymore. It's getting most of it's getting pushed into the center part of your body to keep you warmer. Okay. What about sensory receptors, right? They're part of the nervous system, but you find them in skin. We have what we call external receptors. And what they mean by that is a receptor that is going to sense external changes in the body. Okay? This is the one that can sense if it's cold or warm outside. This is that type of receptor. Or touch. Those are external receptors. Something touching your body. External receptors. Free nerve endings will sense pain, right? A cut, puncture, pinch, too much pressure will kick off these nerve endings for pain. So we got pain there, we got temperature, and we got touch. That's all found in the skin. Those are receptors on the skin. Okay, so again, we just come full circle back to the skin model. That's why I decided to put it here, because I told you that at the beginning, we're going to look at it and then we're going to build everything onto it. And in fact, we've talked about most of it in some form, some capacity, right? Something we talked about in this PowerPoint relates back to the skin model. So that's why the skin model is important to look at, because we're looking at all of those things there. Okay? By the way, here's your nervous system, right? There's a sensory nerve fiber with free nerve endings. Okay? So that's found on the very, I don't know where the dermis and epidermis. Can you see the finger? The dermal papillae? Remember the dermal papillae? Those are the dermal papillae of the fingers, and right in between that finger you'll see a nerve there. Remember there was nerves there as well. That's a free nerve ending. There.
Are all of those bullet points also going to be on the lab exam, or just the?
Yes. Not this one, but the one that's the next one. Yeah, they'll be on there. Yeah, the skin model for sure will be on there. Yeah. Okay. Metabolic functions. Skin actually makes vitamin D, right? So we convert it from an inactive form to an active form in the skin. Does anybody know what is used to convert it from inactive to active form? Let me know this. So we make an inactive form, and then we turn it on or activate it. We change the chemical structure just a little bit, and it becomes activated vitamin D. But we do that in the skin level. Does anybody know what does that change? It's UV light. Yeah, sun. So they tell you to get on the sun if you get a blood panel, if you get blood pulled, let's say in a physical or doctor's visit, they say you have low vitamin D levels. And they'll say I can prescribe, or we can get on vitamin D, or spend some time out in the sun. That's the reason why, because you have inactive forms, and exposing your skin to the sun activates the vitamin D. Does that make sense? Vitamin D is needed for calcium to be absorbed from the food we eat into our body. That's what vitamin D is used for. Just talk about a little bit nutrition kind of thing. Then you'd have low calcium levels. Very, very good. You have what we call hypokalemia, which is low blood calcium, which means you're not getting enough calcium in your blood. And we know that calcium relates a lot to bone tissue, strength of bones, because calcium is one of the components that we put into bone tissue to make it super hard. So you got issues. There can be issues there on that end too. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, that's kind of what you see there. Now, we've got a lot of low vitamin D in this area, and a lot of it is probably because people stay inside most of all because it gets really hot. There's those kind of things that occur here. And we also have a lot of diabetes here, type 2 diabetes, and a lot of cardiovascular disease as well. And all those are kind of related in many ways. Yeah, you see that a lot. So we see this, for example, when we exercise, we use muscle to exercise, then the blood's going to be pulled towards the muscles and away from the skin. And then after we stop doing the exercise, let's say, blood will be redistributed, basically. Places. And excretion, right? Nitrogenous waste comes from the breakdown of mainly proteins in the body. We use proteins for many things in the body. And because of that, we build up a lot of nitrogenous waste, right? If you hear the word nitrogenous waste, what does that mean to you? What is nitrogenous? I mean, yeah, it's toxic. But what is the word? What can you pull from the word that would probably make a lot more sense? You're close. Nitrogen, right? Nitrogen is an element. Nitrogen is one of the elements that you find in proteins. Because we break down proteins, there's a side product always from protein breakdown that we cannot use anymore. And that's what nitrogenous waste is. They all have a nitrogen element to it. That's all that means. All of these right here that I've underlined are all nitrogen based. Okay, ammonia, urea, uric acid, all from. They're just different chemical compositions of almost the same thing. Very close cousins. It'd be like first cousins of themselves chemically. Does that make sense? Right. Now we get rid of these mainly through urine, because that's where urine's yellow color comes from, urea and other nitrous waste. But we can also get it through skin. So skin can take some of this nitrous waste out. Does that make sense? Now when you break down urea, you convert it from urea into ammonia. And that's why people's body odor can sometimes smell like ammonia, kind of stinkiness. Sometimes people have this kind of, they wear a really light colored shirt, they have this yellow tinge to it. Those are the fats in that type of sweat, but also some of the ammonia as well. Does that make sense? Everybody's been around, I mean, probably athletics, been in a gym before somehow, some way, junior high, high school, whatever. And you know people's funk. You know how it's different. Does that make sense? People smell different. That's all because of the chemical composition that's coming from the excretion and sweat. Okay. We're just going to talk about burns. Okay, we're not going to talk about skin cancer, nor is that going to be covered in the exam, right? So they're very interesting to study. Skin cancer is really important. We're already kind of running out of time here. We need to move on to the next chapter, and I've got some other things for you there, right? So what's a first degree burn? The epidermis is damaged only. Okay. Localized redness, edema, which means water is being pulled to that area, swells up, pain. Everybody's experienced a first degree burn in some form or fashion. Bless you. Sometimes your sunburns can be first degree, right? Since we're in summer already. Sometimes your burns can be second degree, right? So it just depends, right? Second degree is the epidermis and upper dermis, papillary region, right? That kind of area. Second degree, almost always you'll see accompanying with blisters. Blisters will form. Okay, those areas where things have been damaged so much, there's fluid there, pushes up, you see a blister. We usually call these partial thickness burns, and the reason why is because just part of the dermis is damaged only. Okay? And third degree is the entire thickness, both epidermis and the entire dermis. That's why we call it full thickness burn. You will always see a huge color change, and these are some of the, you won't see all of them. Sometimes you will, but not always, right? Gray, white appearance to the skin, very cherry red, blood red almost, or blackened or charred, because that sometimes can happen. There's no edema, by the way. Even though you think you're so much damage there, they would see some swelling because the nerve endings are actually burnt off or destroyed completely. The nerve endings send pain signals to the body, to the brain, and the brain says, okay, I need to send fluid there to cause swelling. Since those aren't there anymore, that signal doesn't get sent, and so there's no edema. That's really what that is. Now, skin grafting is usually quite necessary for this, and the reason why is because you've actually damaged the entire epidermis, including all the basal cells. Remember, the basal cells are really important. Those are the ones that stem cells. You've completely destroyed those. So there is no growth of epidermis again there in that area. Nor will there ever will be. That tissue's gone, right? So you can grow it again. Skin grafting is transplanting skin from sometimes another part of your body, usually your thigh area, inside your groin, the back. And usually skin grafting, they'll take tissue and transplant it on there. That'll do a really good job of growing again. So you use other animals to do that. You can use pig to transplant in there as well. So here's your first and second degree. I know it's hard to see, but let me turn off the light so you can see what. The first degree is at the very tips of the fingers, right? You see the redness there. And the second degree, you see blistering forming, right? And I mentioned sunburns can be both, right? Basically. I mean, you can have a third degree burn from sunburns, by the way. You can actually hurt yourself really bad if you burn yourself enough. You see the blistering forming on the palm there. So something happened. I don't know what that might be derived from. That could be chemical burns. It could be an electrical thing. We've seen this a lot in electricians, for example, or folks working on telephone lines, and there's a live wire and they accidentally touch it, or it hits their hand or their body, and then this is what can occur. We see that in chemical burns. Chemicals, when you work with chemicals, sometimes that can happen. Even household chemicals can do this depending on the composition, what chemical you're dealing with. So that can happen actually at home. It doesn't need to be industrial chemicals. And then this one is the third degree. You can see the white here. You see the gray white area right here. You can see the red area right here, kind of right in the middle. You definitely can see the charring right here at the edges, right there. There's the charring, the blackness from the third degree. And again, more than likely that's probably heat, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, because chemical burns can do this, electrical burns, they can all look like this there. Okay? Critical cases, things that are very, very serious that we got to take serious, right? If more than 25% of the body has a second degree burn, which again, sunburns, this can happen. Somebody falls asleep, somebody gets drunk and falls asleep and then burns their back, sleeps there for hours in 110 degree weather, and then this is what happens. Those have been cases for sure. All right. If more than 10% of your body has a third degree burn, then that's considered very critical. If there's any third degree burns on the hands, the face, or the feet, that's a very serious threat. Okay. So what are you doing with these kinds of burns? We can debride, or debridement, which means removal of the burned dead tissue, because that's already dead. There's no way for that to come back again, so you get rid of that, debride it. Depends on the burn, depends on where it's at. This can be a very, very, very painful thing. I've talked to patients that have had burns that had to be debrided, and they've commonly say that that's the worst pain they've ever felt in their life, right? So that's how painful it is. Antibiotics, because of the risk of infection, because you've opened your body up to microorganisms. Remember all those protective things? They're not there anymore if you've burned yourself. Temporary covering, gauzes applied there, coverings, and skin grafts.